There's a lot more surveillance than there ever used to be for police officers, but I still think that there is some police brutality that goes on. And one of the projects that I worked on out in Southern California was related to police brutality, and they actually had a book that was published. It's called October 22nd, where they published all the different people who were actually killed by the police.
Very good. And of course, Dr., let's stop at this juncture for our first commercial break. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The show for today, we're talking to Dr. DBurris-Kitchens from Tennessee State University, and the topic is the criminal justice system of the United States. And of course, Dr. Kitchen, before we had our first commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to continue to talk about what I think you've indicated is what we call police brutality. So let's pick up at that point and talk about it.
Well, as I was saying, they had a publication and a march called October 22nd out in Southern California, where people would protest actual police brutality cases. And they published a book that was literally this thick every year to talk about people who had been shot by police. And these were not cases where the person was challenging the police officer or threatening the police officer. They were cases where the person did not have a weapon, the person's back was to a police officer. Obviously, they were not threatening the police officer in any way, and they should not have used that type of excessive force. So that's why I wanted to talk about that, is because I think that there's still some obvious problems. If you have a group that can come up with that many people who've been victims of that type of crime every year and protest, literally hundreds of thousands protest this on October 22nd, then it's a problem. I wanted to kind of go back to the legal code and how it came out of European history, because I think that's going to lead up to our final discussion as far as racial disparities, because you talked about that just a little bit. When we talk about coming out of the legal code, the first laws that were written were basically to protect property rights owners in the United States, and those property rights owners were European Americans. So excluded from protection from the legal code were obviously Native Americans, African Americans who were brought here and were not U.S. citizens or United States citizens. And because of that, the laws that were written to protect property rights were usually written as repressive laws against those who didn't have access to ownership of property, whether it was Native Americans or whether it was people who were brought here from Africa against their will. Because of that legislation, people of color were criminalized very early in our history, and continued to be criminalized throughout American history up until the 1865 13th Amendment of abolishing slavery was passed. And once they abolished slavery, they put in that with exclusion of, okay, slavery is abolished, but with exclusion of those who have been convicted of a felony offense, and slavery could be used in order as a form of a punishment. So they still use that part of that legislation to enslave predominantly African-American people who were convicted of crimes that they did not get their due process for. So it would go into the court, and of course they would not get a jury. If they did, they certainly didn't get a jury, their peers, and it was one person's word against another, and of course the white person's word was the word of the law, so the person of color was convicted of a particular crime and probably put right back on the plantation that they were freed from a few years prior.
Now, would this be something similar to what you call the chain gang system, that many of these individuals had somehow gone against the law, but it might not be illegal in terms of what they did, but in the end they would be placed back into a situation where they were basically enslaved once again?
Absolutely.
Is that the so-called chain gang system? Is that
yes, that would be part of the chain gang system. Many of the people were put right back on the slave property that they were on prior to being freed from the 1865 legislation. So absolutely. And then of course we had in our legal code that separate but equal. Plessy versus Ferguson was saying also that it was illegal for an African American to go into white establishments or